Good evening, JC.
Good evening, Father Nick.
Welcome back to Discernment Straight Up,
That's
episode
right.
5.
I know, we've been getting through the book quite easily, haven't we?
We have. The technology has been a little bit challenging at times.
It has.
When the cameras work, the mics don't. When the mics work, the cameras don't. But we're working our way through because we're entrusting this work in a particular way. And tonight's episode, we look in a little way at the role of our Blessed Mother, but I think in a very special way we can entrust this work to her maternal care, because she is the mother of priests, the mother of vocations.
Mother of vocations.
But she also crushed the head of the serpent. And
she has.
The evil one doesn't want vocations in the church, and he will kill podcast cameras and make
microphones.
Make microphones extra echoey and things like that. If that is the only way that he can stop vocations, then that's what he'll do.
Well, at least we know we're doing a good job.
Yeah, exactly. So, but we're here tonight. Father Peter Zwans, who's watching us live tonight, JC, just points out that you're hiding behind your mic. But Father Zwans, thanks for that lovely reminder. We're trying to get better audio, and we're not so much worried about the video this evening. So we're trying a whole variety of things, including a phone sort of strapped to a tripod at the last minute. So hopefully if you're listening live, you can hear us this evening, and if you're catching up on the podcast throughout the week, you'll have no idea what we're talking about. But here we go. JC, tonight we're talking about a number of things, but I suppose first of all we're going to look at this idea of fears, because the call to the priesthood and to service as a priest at this time, in these challenging times in the world in which we live, and here in the church in Australia in a particular way, is often quite fear-inducing in the life of young men. When you started discerning, I suppose one of the fears is about giving up marriage. Yes. And it's because marriage is particularly attractive. Was there something about marriage in particular that made it hard or put a bit of a fear into your mind when you started looking at the idea of a vocation?
Yes. Well, growing up, I think by and large, children and myself were encouraged to pursue marriage because, one, it's fulfilling. Marriage as a vocation is quite a fulfilling vocation. And the idea of a family is not foreign, because we all grew up in a family, and we all grew up with mums and dads and brothers and sisters, and I think we were encouraged to pursue that because it was like the norm, or it can be called like a default vocation.
Yeah, and I suppose it's what we all come from, so it is what we know. So the fear of the unknown, I suppose, not. None of us are born of the priesthood, so to speak. So our first knowledge of vocation and what a good vocation is often comes from our own family. Yep,
and we have the role models of our mums and dads.
Yeah. How did your parents respond? We spoke about this a few episodes ago, but did they exhibit any particular fears or anxieties for you, sort of when you told them about the fact that you were thinking about entering the seminary? Yep.
I grew up in a they call I don't like this term. They call it a cradle Catholic family. So I grew up in a devout Catholic family. I'm Filipino in my nationality, in my background, and when I first told my mum, I think it was revealed that she had plans for me, helping out the family here in Australia, but also in the Philippines, and I think that's a sentiment that many migrant families have, is that the children of the parents who migrated to Australia get a good job, get a good education, and then support the family once they establish themselves in the country. And I think my mum had similar desires in that regard, and so there was a lot of fear in terms of what the future holds for our family. But when it came to my dad, he was actually very quiet, and he was very sober when he heard my desires for the priesthood and for the seminary, and I knew that he was very supportive from the very beginning. Not that my mum wasn't, but my dad immediately saw the supernatural aspect of that calling, And I suppose every time we go to Mass on Sundays, I would see my mum and my dad praying. And also, once in a while, they would pray for priests and to have more priests. And, if the Lord calls one of your sons and you've been praying for priests every Sunday...
You can't really say everybody else except him, Lord.
Yeah, right. So,
my family had lots of questions. So my mother was a convert to Catholicism, so there was actually a bit of a difference, like your family, between how my mum responded and how my dad responded.
Right.
My dad was very quiet, like you describe your own father, but
Yes.
because he grew up as a Catholic and because there had been priests around his family home growing up, I think I get the sense that there was a general awareness. He understood what it was all about. Where my mum, I think, had a lot more questions, and she had her own fears and anxieties.
Right.
But so too did my sisters. And again, extended family and friends. I think a lot of people, because they don't know a lot, and also about the diocesan priesthood, I think a lot of people think, and I definitely know that one of my sisters thought that when I told them that I was going to the seminary, she thought I was joining a monastery,
Right.
and that I was that they'd never see me again. So I think there's a general fear and anxiety because of the unknown, even amongst families of seminarians. But of course, then there's those things that attract you to the priesthood. Was there anything in particular in those early stages that you found was attractive to the priesthood in particular, that I suppose helped alleviate some of those fears?
Oh, yes. It was attraction to service. A priest is a man of communion, and he's a man of the community, the greater community, the local parish, the church, the charities that happen around, and the schools, as well as hospitals and nursing homes, as I later found out in the seminary, that the priests are involved in. But it's that essential call to service which really attracted me. And I realised from my when I was an adolescent and growing up in high school that service was very fulfilling. So I was quite involved with the community, and every time we would have community service or have community volunteering activities, it gave me life. And when I saw a priest dedicating his whole life, basically, after he said yes to the Lord and fulfilled his formation and got ordained, that whole life is dedicated to service, primarily for God, but outward is to the whole people of the parishes that he has served. Am I talking too much?
Yeah, I'm gonna put a buzzer on you now. If you go over the time limit, it's gonna go off. I think this idea of service is a very common one, and I myself was involved quite heavily in the St. Vincent de Paul Society. Lots of people who come through programs like NET or the youth mission team or other opportunities to serve at the mission of the church find that as a really important sort of beginning of a vocation, because the life of a priest is dedicated to service. A big part for me was, and again, this was that sort of balance between the fear of not having my own family, but seeing how priests were involved in every family. And there's that great poem, O Priest of Jesus Christ, where there's that line where you are the father of none, but the father of many, or sort of in no family of your own, but in many families. There's lots of different translations, or in every family. And I've definitely found that since I've been a priest, is that we have this great opportunity to enter into the lives of the families that we're called to serve. And that's something very particular, I think, about the diocesan priesthood, because we live with the people, we live for the people, and we're called to serve the people each and every day, and that is in a very familial manner. So whilst we don't have families of our own, we're called to be in the world and in the families of the people that we serve. And someone I described the idea of priestly clerical dress to me once, about this idea of the black represents the world, and the white represents the presence of Christ.
Wow.
And that the priest is called to be that little presence of Christ in the world in which he lives, and in every circumstance. And we spoke about this a few episodes ago, but when you walk into the hospital room of a dying person, you don't walk in as the individual, you walk in as the presence of Christ. When you're baptizing a child at the beginning of their life, you're doing it as in the presence of Christ. And when you're hearing the confessions or celebrating the Eucharist, you're not doing it as the individual, you're doing it in the presence of Christ.
Yep.
So that's what the call is. I've just noticed that the phone has decided to put a thing up on the screen, so let's just try and do this without technology, hey?
Yeah, we got your calendar on the screen. I wonder if it's right by me saying, Father Nicholas, that apart from the cross or the crucifix, the most recognizable aspect of spiritual life or clerical life is the collar.
Well, I think it is, and I think it is for most priests who choose to wear the collar every day. It is a sign of that willingness to serve, and just like our armed forces have a uniform, just like our police have a uniform, just like our doctors and nurses have a uniform, so that we know who they are. Priests choose to wear it as a visible sign, which again, like the father of a family, means that if I'm sitting in an airport, even if I'm traveling sort of privately, but when I'm dressed as a priest, I'm on duty. As I go down the street to do my shopping, if you know what I mean, people love to check out what's in Father's shopping basket, if you know what I mean, because I'm always on duty. But it actually provides a real wonderful opportunity to be that presence of Christ in the world in which we live. We're making our way through to Save 1,000 Souls, and this week we're focusing on chapter 11, where Father Brannan speaks in particular about the role of Mary in the discernment of a vocation. Did Mary play a significant role in your own discernment?
Yes, she really did, and it's always in contrast with spiritual warfare with the devil. So when I received the calling, the rosary, I was given a rosary, and it was a rosary blessed by St. John Paul II, and it's the rosary where people who go to Rome get like a rose smelling rosary, and it had his iconic crucifix on it, and every time I would pray it, I would pray for purity, piety, and perseverance, and every time I would pray it, I noticed that there was another presence, and it was I felt it was quite evident that it was the evil presence, because things would suddenly not go south, but you can tell that there was an oppressive presence. And every time I would look at the Blessed Mother on the rosary, she would tell me, "Don't fear, just trust in me. I will lead you forward." And ever since then, I had entrusted my vocation, my perseverance, my prayers, and the purity of my intentions to Mary, to guard and protect against the evil one. Because the evil one is very cunning, and he's always looking for weaknesses and fears to munch on.
And it's interesting. So he puts together in this chapter the role of the Blessed Virgin in discernment with the question of fears and anxieties. And he outlines this long list of the 20 sort of most common fears.
It's a long list.
It just keeps going. I'm thinking, wow, if I didn't have the fear beforehand.
Here it is, I know.
Yeah, now I do. You know what I mean? It's a little bit too late. But he really, I suppose, outlines, and it's from his many years of experience as a vocations director himself and working with young men across lots of circumstances. He outlines for readers sort of some of those most common sort of experiences and fears. And a number of them spoke to me from my own experience, one of them being obviously that fear of loneliness. And I think that was a big one, not only for me, but for my family.
Yep.
My family were fearful that I was going to be alone, especially with the idea of diocesan priesthood, because more often than not these days, we see that diocesan priests live on their own.
Yep.
So there was this great fear. And for me also, it's coupled with that fear of celibacy and never marrying and never having a wife and a family of my own. So I think that was one of probably the biggest obstacles for me growing up, and he addresses that in this chapter. Was there anything that sort of jumped out to you?
Yes, actually, one of them was a fear of being overworked.
Okay.
I've been in your parish for quite some time now, And I've realised that you're quite busy, Father. To be honest,
this is the quiet time during COVID-19.
I know,
lockdown.
and it's on lockdown.
This is lockdown.
Well, one of the reasons why I think you're quite busy is because you're a capable man, and you're very competent, and that fear of being overworked, we hear it in the professional life of being burnt out and being bogged down with the pressures of performing, and that's a fear that resonated with me, because I've realised that you gain skills in different areas, and you realise that they're quite useful in building up a parish, building up a community, and you don't know when to say no at times, and you're always saying yes because you're a person of the people.
I'm a people person.
Yeah, you're a people person.
Most of the time. I don't mind a bit of Netflix every now and then just to calm down. One of the things, and I think this fear of being overworked is a legitimate one. And Cardinal Dolan, when he was the rector of the North American College, gave a series of talks to the seminarians studying in Rome at that time. And in one of them, he addresses this idea of being overworked. And he says sometimes we priests bring it on ourselves, because as soon as somebody asks us, how are you going? Our first response is, I'm busy, I'm really busy, I'm very busy. Yes. And he points out in that talk a couple of things. He said, one, be careful of that, because they're busy also.
Yes.
That priests aren't the only busy people in the world. Everybody's busy. And I only have to go and have dinner with my sister and brother-in-law, or any of the friends of mine who are married with small children, and watch them who work full-time all day, and then go home and have
full-time
to look after
parents,
children,
yes.
and do the school run and lunches and washing and all of these things, and go, do you know what, whilst I'm busy,
they're quite busy
as well. But also that it can feed into this fear. And there is a lot of talk about a shortage of priests and a crisis of vocations, and not enough priests for the parishes that we have at the moment, which could really be feeding into this fear in young men that, well, why would I do that if I'm going to be run off my feet? So I think it's important for people to be able to name and acknowledge that fear, but also, and we'll have a look a little bit later on about what some of Father Brett's sort of suggestions for dealing with these fears are. I think another one that I come across quite regularly, and he addresses this in a number of sort of sections. So he gives 20. Some of them I think could be sort of bundled into one. But he speaks about this fear of causing scandal, this fear of being a hypocrite, and this fear of being unworthy. And this is one that I've encountered quite regularly amongst the young men that I've worked with here in Melbourne, as they're discerning. That they're acutely aware of their own sinfulness. They're acutely aware that throughout the history of the church and our most recent history, priests have done the wrong thing.
Indeed, yes.
And they're fearful that their own sinfulness will make them hypocrites and will cause scandal on the church. So it's a real fear that I've encountered. Have you encountered that with young men that you meet?
Yes, I have. And it's and I feel that there's a lot of overemphasizing their own personal sins, and that with the news and the scandals that have rocked our church in the last few years can be magnified, and then you sort of see yourself. It's a bad area, a bad place to be in.
And of course, the church is very conscious that priests who have committed crimes and whose sins have become grave matter for the whole church and done incredible damage. And there's lots of things that are now in place to ensure that those kind of men don't enter the seminary and don't progress through the seminary. But helping young men address their own fear of their own personal sin, or maybe their personal history, is an important step in the discernment process. So whilst, again, that first step is being able to acknowledge that. The retired auxiliary bishop of Melbourne, Bishop Peter Elliott, a few years ago, did an interview about vocations, and he spoke about that we need to be humble, but not overly humble, not falsely humble. And he said that sometimes we can say, well, I'm too much of a sinner, and we can use that as an excuse not to follow the will of the Lord. And he says, all you need to do is look at those first apostles. He said, look at that ragtag bunch of men to realize that you don't have to be perfect. You're allowed to have a history.
Yes.
But you need to be able to acknowledge that history and be ready to work through it.
Yeah, excellent.
There's a couple of others, I suppose, that jump up quite regularly. Obviously, that fear of obedience. And I think this is a big one, and we spoke about this a few weeks back as well. But the idea that I'm giving my life in service of the church, and I have to be willing and ready to do what the bishop asks, even if I don't like it.
I actually have a question for you, and it goes about that that idea of obedience. Is well, I'm not sure with our viewers, but the majority of priests move from parish to parish every 6 years, and you get into a parish, you get to know people, you get to know families. And what's it like moving after 6 years? You've established yourself, you've established a lot of good relationships and got to know a lot of good people, and then you're suddenly moved, and sometimes you have to move from one end to another.
Well, I suppose I haven't been in a place for 6 years just yet. I'm coming up on 5 years in my current parish.
Right,
and then before that, as an assistant priest, you actually move quite regularly. So in my first 6 years of being a priest, I moved through 3 different parishes because it's part of the experience to give you a breadth of experience. But that being willing to pack up and go when the bishop asks, and being willing to give yourself over is an important part of the process.
Can you negotiate?
Can you negotiate? Well, a priest said to me quite recently that he fears that sometimes in the church today, the vow of obedience has become a vow of negotiation.
Oh my goodness.
Which, I don't know about it, but that might be the case for the seminarians in particular. But we'll give it a test out tomorrow morning.
I think we've been trained differently
to unpack the dishwasher. Okay. There is always a conversation, and I think again, allaying some of the fears. No longer is it that the bishop just calls up overnight and says you're going, and there's no explanation and there's no reason given
behind it.
The bishop is, and especially here in Melbourne, the bishop is very keen to work with his priests and not work from above them. So a lot of conversation goes in. Now, does that mean that at the end of the day, if the bishop wants you to do something and you don't want to do it, that you still do it? Yes, you do, and that's part of the vow of obedience. Wow. But again, there's a lot of similarities there to marriage and the idea of marriage. That husbands and wives are called to be obedient to each other, which means that there needs to be an openness to change and a willingness to do the will of the other. So, Father Brennan then sort of addresses this idea of, okay, well, what do we do when we find that we have these fears, and how do we move these fears and turn them into concerns? So he uses this idea of fears versus concerns, or anxiety versus concerns, and that fear in and of itself is a bad thing. And fear generally comes to us from the evil one, but a concern in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, and that we can use fear and turn it into a concern, and then we can grow through it. And so it's really important that we are able in that first instance to be able to address and sort of say, okay, I am fearful about these things, but as we spoke about a couple of weeks back, we then need to work out what is the origin of that fear. Where is that fear coming from?
Yes.
Because the Lord doesn't instill fear in us. So it's coming from somewhere else, and it might be coming from something that is within us that we need to address, and address that with our spiritual director or with our confessor or with the vocations director perhaps. It might be coming from the world, and I think this is a really big one at the moment, especially for young men, discerning, is that the world puts a whole lot of fears and anxieties because the world says that you have to do this, this and this to be happy. Yet the church says something different. And then when we find ourselves being called into something that is different to the world, there can be a fear at the bottom. And the other thing, of course, is then there's the evil one who, as we said, doesn't want priests, and he will ruin microphones and podcasts, and he will also implant these fears into the heart of young men to keep them from following the will of the Lord. So Father Brandon speaks about the fact that fear paralyzes. It stops movement.
It does.
And he speaks about this fact that vocation, as we're saying, we're standing up. It's a movement. It's something that must be done. It's an action. And fear paralyzes and stops. So we need to sort of be motivated, and this is where we can turn those fears into sort of appropriate concerns. As a young man, the thought of celibacy should raise some appropriate concern in you.
Yes.
The thought of giving your life in obedience to the bishop, there should be some concern. One of the other ones he speaks about is this fear that guys have of not having the academic qualifications or the knowledge or the courage to preach.
Yeah.
The idea of preaching in front of a church full of people should
frighten many.
It's just around the corner for you, JC, diaconal ordination sometime this year.
Yes.
Does it still instill a bit of fear?
Actually, it doesn't.
It doesn't. There we go. Perfect example. Why not?
I think the message that you have to give to people far outweighs the fear of the stage. You have something special. You have the pearl of great price, let's say, and you can proclaim it. You can share it, and I think that far outweighs, the fear of being in the spotlight for maybe 5 minutes. So I look at it in that way, and it's the message. It's not me. I feel that many people have fears because they're fearful of what others would see in them. But I think the message really...
I'm sure, JC, you'd like to acknowledge all the hard work that your seminary professors and formators have done over the last 7 years.
They've totally built me up. They've built me up to be ready and to do the preparations.
And Father Brennan speaks about this. He says that remember that fear at the beginning of the process is normal, but also remember that this is why the church gives you 7 years of formation, and it
sure does.
The finest priests it has in charge of your formation to help you not just overcome these fears, but how do you overcome them? You overcome them with knowledge.
Yep.
And the fact is that over the last 7 years, JC, you've sat in theological lectures, and you've sat in catechetical lectures, and you've sat through mass after mass after mass, listening to some of the best preachers that we have and learning just by being in their presence. You've sat through homiletic classes. So the seminary system and the formation that you receive on your way to priesthood in and of itself is the way to overcome the fears that you're experiencing. The other thing, of course, he points out is those theological virtues that we should just be able to know that these things help solve all things.
Yes.
So to alleviate, if we are feeling a legitimate fear, to turn it into a concern, we should throw ourselves onto the Lord and what he offers us through those virtues of faith, hope and love. So faith, we should build our knowledge. Okay, I've got a legitimate concern about the call to celibacy. Well, the best way to help alleviate that is to read and to deepen my understanding of why the church calls me to that. Yeah. I should hope. I should be approaching it with the fact that there is this sense of a supernatural hope that the Lord is asking of this, that I won't be miserable. If I think I'm going to be miserable, if I cannot find a sense of supernatural hope in it, then I'm never going to be happy. And then finally, obviously, this all things in love, and we're speaking about this. If we're doing it out of love for the Lord and for his people, then the virtue will grow in us as well. So lots of things to do. And of course, the theological virtues are going to help us tackle and enter into that battle with Satan himself. But the best person, and he takes us back at the end of the chapter to the very beginning of turning to our Blessed Mother.
Our Lady.
And in a particular way, I really encourage the guys that I work with to really meditate on the Annunciation.
Wow.
And on the fact that as this young woman, with her whole life in front of her, the Lord asked of her something that was going to change her life forever.
Change the world, yes.
And change the world. And she had the complete freedom to say no. But that she was willing to step out in faith and hope and love for the Lord and give her life in service.
Yep.
So really turning to her with a complete trust.
Yep.
A complete trust, and asking her to guide and intercede. And he speaks about the importance of a daily rosary, which I think is essential if you're looking to grow in God's call in your own life and grow in your own willingness to say yes to the Lord's call in your life.
Yep.
I didn't grow up with a particularly strong Marian devotion, and it's something that I've had to develop throughout my young adulthood and throughout my time in the seminary and as a priest. But I can assure you that every time I've turned with any real devotion to our Blessed Mother,
Yes.
amazing things have happened.
Yes,
Miraculous things have happened. So
it's a hard devotion at the beginning, but because it's hard, it's the most beautiful, I think. And Father Nick, you led me to a book, Total Consecration by St. Louis de Montfort. I'm actually doing it at the moment, and it's been such a blessing, especially during the time of COVID-19. So thank you.
Well, thanks St. Louis, because
Yes.
they're his meditations, but they're a wonderful gift to the church. So we're all out of time, but we will be back next week. And next week we're going to really look at the important role of having a spiritual director.
Yes.
How to find one, how it works. What do we speak about? What do we not speak about? What's the role of spiritual direction?
The internal, external. Are we talking about?
We'll talk about that as well. Why not? Why not? But then we're going to talk about that big question that a lot of young guys face, and that is, when do I start? When do I enter? I'm halfway through a uni degree. Do I stop my uni? Do I go now? Do I go straight after school? So we're going to start to unpack that a little bit next week as well. So thanks everyone for listening. If you are listening live from the Archdiocese of Melbourne or Adelaide, feel free to join us for the after show catch up via Zoom. If you don't have the details already, you can contact the vocations office in either Adelaide or Melbourne via Facebook immediately after the live podcast, and we'll forward you on the details. But otherwise, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Father Nick. Yeah.
You share it around. We will, by the end of this series,
we'll get it
the technology down pat. But hopefully you've at least been able to hear something tonight. But thanks very much. God bless. We'll catch up with you next week.